Okay, I think we'll get started. Hello everyone, my name's Brendan Spillane. I work in Warwick Innovations in the university and I'm head of digital. And the whole reason this came about is because my boss went for a chat up at the university hospital in Coventry, and it became apparent that some teams in the university are not using NHS data correctly. And I've had personal experience of that as well. And Rob, who's not here today, has had experience of that from risk point of view as well. So my boss asked me to put something together in terms of a training seminar, and this is it. And what I did was make different contacts around the university, and the whole team's here today. So I'd like them to just go around and quickly introduce themselves.
Where are we starting, Brendan? Who do you want to? Shall I start?
Well, you go first, Jill.
Okay. So hi, nice to see you. I'm Jill Wood and I'm a quality assurance manager at our clinical trials unit here at the university.
I'll go next. Hi, I'm Ikrima Abubakar, Junior Legal Counsel here at the University of Warwick, part of the Legal and Compliance team. So I'll be assisting with more the data protection side of this meeting today.
And I'll go next. Hi, I'm Dr. Esther Idun. I am the Information Security Awareness and Training Manager. I work here in the Risk and Compliance Group in the Information Security team, IDG, in the university.
I'm Joanna Bates. I'm also part of Warwick Innovations, the tech transfer team. I'm looking after managing the recording and editing and online posting of this event and any follow-up. So you'll get a note from me afterwards saying where you can find the recording, and you're free to share it with any colleagues.
And I would just like to put out a massive thanks to Jill, who's done 99% of the work for this. So I've only got a couple of points to make. NHS data, as in stuff that comes from hospitals, is very different to GP data. And we're not covering GP data today because they run on proprietary systems that are run by a multitude of different companies. So if you're trying to use GP data, it's no good just asking the GP. You have to ask the company that holds the data as well. The second point is that if you're going to use NHS data, you clearly have to ask permission first to be granted access. If you ask for academic use, you can only use it within the university or any other university that's got a collaboration agreement, which doesn't go very far. If you want to use that work later in a clinical setting, you have to ask for clinical use as well as academic use. But if you want to use it in the outside world, you have to ask for commercial use. And I know a lot of academics don't like asking for commercial use. They think it's going to be detrimental, but in fact, it's absolutely essential, and it is much easier to do it up front than try and go back and get it afterwards. And I know this from experience. So if you want to use it in the outside world later, just ask for commercial use up front. Anyway, Jill, over to you. Thank you.
Great. I'm going to share my slides, and that's a nice little introduction really into this, because the theme throughout my session today is planning. Upfront planning of what you're going to do is the key. So I'm going to share. Oh, it's not going very well to start with. Sorry, bear with me. Can you see that okay?
Yes, that's fine.
Lovely. Okay, so if everyone's ready, I'm going to take you through today some considerations for using NHS data in research. And I'm going to talk about two different sources of NHS data. The main one I'm going to focus on, as Brendan said, is these kind of large data sets held centrally by NHS England, previously known as NHS Digital. Their function is to curate and use the nation's health data to drive research and transform care. But I'll also mention data that might be obtained directly from the NHS, from hospital or secondary care providers. Just to add context really, because it's a slightly different situation. So hopefully we're all here because we already know that using NHS data in research has a lot of potential. But just to recap, really, it can provide unprecedented insights. NHS England data covers a massive population containing detailed information from millions of participants and patients. This allows researchers to identify trends, spot rare diseases, and understand how conditions affect different demographics in a way that smaller studies can't. It can also provide faster discoveries. So NHS data is constantly updated, providing researchers with real-time information. So you can do anything from tracking outbreaks to testing treatment effectiveness, and also to just accelerate medical breakthroughs generally. It also provides a joined up picture. So traditionally, health data has been scattered across different systems, like Brendan said, with GP data. But NHS England data integrates information from various sources, giving researchers a sort of a holistic view of a patient's health journey and the surrounding factors that influence it. So a really powerful source of information for researchers, but accessing it is not an entirely simple journey. But I'm aiming today just to give you an introduction and a flavour for it. Of some of the things you might need to consider if you want to go on this exciting journey. So why is it me here talking to you today? I'm with some really experienced people, and I might seem like a slightly unusual choice, but we've already mentioned the potential of NHS data, and it's not surprising that researchers are keen to utilise this in research. However, it's a complicated space, and we're aware, as Brendan said as well, that practice isn't always compliant. So we want to equip you with the tools that you need to do this well, and continue leading kind of world-class research. So I work in one of the directorates of the medical school, known as Warwick Clinical Trials Unit. We're nationally recognised as one of the largest recipients of NIHR research grants amongst the clinical trials units registered in the UK. And the CTU has 4 research themes covering emergency care, surgery, pain and rehabilitation, and cancer, and until recently some maternity type studies. And we're running a large number of national and internationally led trials on new treatments, complex interventions, and those are led by academics. We receive data from a number of NHS health and social care sources in order to deliver our research outcomes. So I have some experience in using this data, and we've learned lots of lessons along the way. So my role is in quality assurance, which means I'm responsible with my fellow colleagues for ensuring our research processes protect the rights and freedoms of research participants, the safety of participants, and the integrity and the security of the data that we're collecting. So I've got around 18 years clinical research experience, but I've been a quality assurance manager for around 7 of those years. A lot of my work involves information governance and how we're handling data. So I'm the chair of our data sharing committee and the deputy chair of our information governance working group. I'm responsible for coordinating our data security and protection toolkit submission for our trials unit, which I'll come back to at a later point in the presentation. And I've also taken a lead role recently in 2 external audits that we have had from NHS England. on the use of our data. Therefore, I'm hopefully a good person to give you that kind of overview of the sorts of things you need to think about when planning to use this sort of data. But as you've seen, I'm joined by some really experienced colleagues who have specialist knowledge in some of the areas that we're going to touch on today, such as data security and protection. So I'm here to introduce and signpost really to those with relevant experience, just so you know what's involved. So I'm sure there's a few of you that have recently or are soon heading off on a summer holiday breakaway. And when we're packing for a trip or an adventure, there are some essentials that we need to maximise the success of the trip. First, we need our itinerary. So that's a plan of what we're going to do, where we're going to go and how we're going to get there. We need to make sure we have the paperwork in place, an up-to-date passport, the right visas or permissions to enter the country we're going to. And for those of us who are more risk averse, we'll likely take out some sort of travel insurance in case of unexpected accidents or illness on your journey. Most of us will take some basic first aid in the form of first aid kit containing aftersun, I don't know, plasters, bandages, paracetamol, maybe rehydration sachets in case we by accident drink the water. And we might also take some preventative actions to reduce the risk of accidents and illnesses, such as taking and wearing sun cream or having vaccinations if we're going to somewhere particularly exotic. And then finally, we're going to need to grab our map or our guidebook to help us find our way around once we get there. But why am I talking to you about holiday packing, you ask? Well, this is not entirely different a process to preparing and working with NHS data for research. And today we're going to go through some of the things you will need to pack into your knowledge bank to consider if you're ever going to embark on a journey of using NHS data in your research. So that's where I'm going with this. So I'm here today to talk specifically about the use of NHS data in research. So just that we're all on the same page from the beginning, I'm just going to clarify what I mean by that. And NHS England say that the research is the systematic investigation into the study of materials and sources to establish facts and to reach new conclusions. So I have less experience of its use in the commercial setting, as Brendan's kind of said about this morning. So everything I've included here is under the scope of research under this definition and therefore might not apply in a commercial use scenario. So there may be some additional things that you would need to factor in if you were to select that you were going to use it for commercial use. So this definition excludes audits of practice and service evaluations. It's a broad definition and encompasses all sorts of things such as clinical trials and clinical investigations, public health research, observational studies, discovery science, and also research into supporting policy making and commissioning, social care research, and translational research. So lots of different things under that definition. Great, so now we've established the scope. Let's go back to planning our journey with the very beginning. So where we're going and how we're going to get there. The first thing you're going to need to decide when you start your journey is where you're going and what route you're going to take to get there. Planning is the key to a successful trip, and this is absolutely no different when you're thinking about using NHS data for your research. Just like planning a trip, you're going to need to establish exactly what you are trying to achieve and how you're going to get there. There are several different routes, depending on where you'll get the data from. So first, you're going to need to articulate your purpose or your why. What are your key outcomes? And as researchers, you'll know that you're going to need a protocolized plan and an idea of the exact data you will require to achieve your outcomes. It will need to be the minimum amount of data you need to achieve your purpose, not the maximum. Most of you as researchers will be familiar with that concept, and it's a critical part of being compliant with data protection regulations. So as part of this planning, you're going to need to work out where you will get your NHS data from, which will then determine the route you'll need to take, which I'll come back to later. If you're going to use data sets curated by NHS England, which is the main focus really of this session, then it's a really good option. The data is already collected, curated centrally from usual NHS practice. It's been coded. It's a very data efficient and less burdensome way of reaching your research outcome if possible. The NHS England website has lots of information about data sets they hold, but they cover a really wide range of health topics. They have national data sets, they have linked data sets, which allow researchers to combine data from different sources to get a more comprehensive picture of health and care. They have highly curated data sets. So these are really high quality data sets that are on a national scale, including things like cancer registries and rare diseases. They've also got some more specific data sets such as hospital episode statistics, National Cancer Registration and Analysis Service data, and data on congenital abnormalities and rare disease registration. They've also got some kind of ad hoc data sets such as those related to COVID-19 and hospitalizations in that area. So loads and loads of different data sets that are available to utilise. It may be that you need to supplement data collection by getting some data directly from secondary care in hospitals. And that's what we do at the CTU. So we collect some of our data from secondary care or direct from patients themselves, and then we utilise NHS England data for data linkage on long-term survival or disease recurrence and things like that. Either way, data from any NHS health and social care source is considered NHS data and needs to be treated with a high level of security due to the sensitive nature of its content, which I'm sure you'll appreciate. Which leads me on to my next slide, which is again part of your route planning. We need to understand some of our risks up front, and our risks will guide us, hopefully, to take the safest routes possible. So I'm going to keep coming back to this principle during the talk, but like any trip to somewhere new, you need to understand the risks associated with the travel to the countries or places you're going to, and that's true here too with research involving NHS data. So to understand your risks, it's important to understand the classification of your data that you plan to collect or receive. Once you understand these things, you can plan your processes in a way that you can be assured that you are compliant with all the regulations that govern the use of data. So there are lots of different ways to classify your data, but it's important to say that these are not necessarily discrete, so your data may fall across more than one of these classifications. So at a university level, we would need to apply our own policies and procedures on information classification, and we do have a policy that goes over how to classify our data into one of three categories. And those categories are based on the impact of disclosure. So information seen as low risk would have little impact if it was disclosed publicly, whereas data seen as high risk may actually cause significant harm to health and safety. It might facilitate a crime or result in significant financial and reputational damage for the organisation. So the policy also has associated procedures, which, based on your classification, you can know how to store it and move it around safely. So that's a really important thing to do if you're collecting data and you're going to be using university systems. At a wider level, it's important in research to determine if the data is confidential. So if you need to know if it's confidential, you'll need to follow the principles of the common law duty of confidentiality. And that says that confidential data is not for public dissemination. It's also not to be shared outside of reasonable expectations, and the duty of confidentiality persists when patients pass away. You'll also need to make an assessment as to whether your data is personal data. Some people use those terms interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. Personal is different to confidential, as it applies to living subjects only, and can only be in the public, and it can be in the public domain, unlike confidential data. There are certain subcategories of personal data which are regarded as more sensitive, such as health data, ethnicity data, and those are known as special category personal data types. So your data in theory could be personal, it could also be confidential, and it may be high risk. So there's lots of things to consider when classifying your information. If your data is personal, you'll need to follow the principles of UK GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation, which I'm sure you have all heard of because we've been talking about it for years. And I've added a signpost here if you want to read a little bit more about this, but happy to take questions at the end. And I know Akrima's here, and he's the expert in all things GDPR, I think. And all these things are critical to plan up front, because the data classification is intimately connected with the approvals and the permissions that you might need to access the data, and also the strategies that you might put in place to keep it safe. So get it wrong, and worst case scenario, you'll not reach your destination, and you could cause the university some reputational and financial damage at the same time. So not ideal, really important. So quick reminder for any of you who are not sure, I'm not going to go into these in detail, but I will pass to Akrima in a moment if he's got anything to add. Most record level patient data in a health data set would be very difficult to render anonymous. Some of it will be, and there'll be vast amounts of data in those data sets. And working knowledge of the principles of UK GDPR are probably going to be key, because it's very unlikely it's going to be anonymous data. There are 7 principles, the first of which is all about being lawful, fair and transparent. The second is about only keeping it for as long as you need it. The third one is making sure that data that you do hold is accurate. The fourth one, which I alluded to earlier, is only collecting the minimum amount of personal data you need to achieve your objectives. If you can do it with less identifiable data, then you should be doing that. And you should only be collecting it for the purpose that you've stated. And finally, you should be keeping it secure. And I'm going to revisit Principles 1 and Principle 6 a little bit further in the session later. There's a 7th principle of accountability, which is kind of an umbrella principle, which means that you need to be able to demonstrate that you are adhering to these principles and someone's responsible for them. Akrima, do you want to come in with anything and add anything to that? Because that is very basic.
Yeah, I think you've explained them all quite well. I was just going to also add that whenever we do want to, or you do want to do something new with the information, you should always revisit these GDPR principles. Say, if, for example, you had initially collected the data or received the data for a specific purpose to do with research, and then you decide at another point that you might want to start sharing with a third party, you should look back and have a look at, is it lawful? Did we have a lawful basis for sharing the data? Did the individuals know that we were going to be sharing it? Do we need to go back and get those consent or different types of revisiting the purpose? And if, for example, if security, etc., do we need to have a different system now that we're having a third party and accessing it? So it's just something to always remember whenever we do something differently with the personal data.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. That links to my kind of initial slide about kind of having a protocolized plan, because that's where your purpose is going to be. And if your purpose is outside of that, then that's the point to revisit these principles. Yeah, thank you. That's really useful. So we've planned our journey. We now know where we're going. We know what the risks involved are because we've classified our information. And the next step is to get all of that paperwork in place to allow us to just embark on the journey. And hopefully all of our planning will enable us to work that out and what we need. So authorization to embark on your journey is essential. You wouldn't travel without a valid passport or the appropriate visa in place for the country that you're visiting. So planning to work with NHS data, again, is exactly the same. My analogy is working. The authorization path you go down will be dependent on those decisions you made in that early planning itinerary phase around where you'll get the data from and what the classification is. So the first set of authorizations or approvals you're going to need are institutional or NHS approvals. And these are to ensure that those institutions and places are happy with the research proposal, they're happy that it's ethical, and that the institution can support and indemnify you and the research. The second set of approvals are the approvals of the people whose data you're going to be using. That's whether you're going to be contacting them directly or using these pre-established NHS data sets. Finally, you're going to need approval from the places where you'll get the data from. So that will be NHS England if you're going to apply for data from them, or from individual NHS trusts if you're going to be getting it from secondary care sites such as hospitals. So I'm going to explore each of these individually and how you might go about initiating some of these approvals, because there's actually quite a lot to think about. And I think this is one of the trickiest bits to navigate when we're looking at NHS data. So the first one is looking at these institutional and NHS approvals. So this I've put on here, which can come back to you later, I'm not going to go through it, is a basic decision tree. But essentially, the message here is if you are using NHS data, whether it's anonymous or identifiable, you will need approval from an ethics committee. The ethics committee you apply to will depend on whether your data is anonymous, i.e. that it's rendered so you couldn't identify an individual from it. So ethical approval is needed for any research that involves human participants or their data or their tissue. So very little research really will not need ethical approval of some sort. Anonymous data from the NHS will require you to apply for institutional ethics approval. So the university has a biological sciences research ethics committee. But if you're going to be using identifiable or personal data or confidential NHS data, then you will be required to apply for ethical approval via an NHS research ethics committee. So hopefully, and I'll keep stressing it, you're beginning to see why it's so important to understand these things up front and how your information is classified, because it really will impact on the journey and approvals you're going to take. As well as ethics approval, and in fact, before you even get ethics approval, you will need University of Warwick sponsorship approval. So it's a requirement under the UK Policy Framework for Health and Social Care that research involving NHS patients, their staff, or their data has a research sponsor. So the university has a sponsorship and oversight committee who will receive applications and make decisions on whether institutionally there is appropriate insurance and financial arrangements in place to conduct the research, and that those conducting the research are well equipped to do so. So that's basically the first decision on this pathway, followed by your research ethics approval. So you can't just go ahead and start using people's NHS data. The likelihood is that if you use this data, it will be individual record level patient data, might not contain names and addresses, the classic kind of personal data that we think of, but it's likely to contain a number of indirect identifiers, such as date of birth, or it might contain rare medical condition information that actually renders it potentially identifiable, and therefore will likely to be personal data. The data is also likely, therefore, to be confidential because it will contain health data by the nature of its NHS data. So both the common law duty of confidentiality and the UK GDPR both say that you need a legal basis to process this data. But what does that actually mean? And it's that first principle in UK GDPR, isn't it, of being lawful. But what does it mean? And how does it link to getting permission from individuals to get their data? Well, this means that both common law and GDPR require you as a researcher to have a justification for having someone's personal or confidential data. GDPR provides a specific list of reasons that are acceptable, which I've listed on the slide here, you can see, while common law might be a bit broader depending on the situation. But each justification comes with certain requirements that you might need to fulfill. So you'll have to bear with me. This is quite a complicated one, but it's really important that I make you aware of it. So in research, getting permission from the data subject or the participants is usually via informed consent. So anyone who's conducted research before will probably be familiar with informed consent. There are lots of purposes behind informed consent, but one of those is permission under the common law for you to use their confidential data. Because research is not considered a reasonable expectation for the use of someone's confidential data, consent is one of those lawful bases or justification that can be used. There are some situations where consent isn't practical, and there is a demonstrable, overwhelming public interest in the research question, and therefore there are alternative justifications. For instance, Section 251 of the NHS Act says that if there is enough justification, you might be able to use people's confidential data without their consent if you have approval from the Confidentiality and Advisory Committee, which is also known as CAG. So there's a couple of different legal bases you can rely on under the common law if you're using confidential data. You'll see on the list that consent is also an available lawful basis or justification under GDPR. But for research, this is rarely the legal basis on which we would rely, partly because there are no exemptions available to protect the integrity of research. So if research is in the public benefit, then we can often rely on one of the alternative justifications, such as a task in the public interest or legitimate interests. If you want to read more about those, I've popped a link on the slide. But this essentially means that consent under GDPR is rarely needed in research. But that doesn't mean you still don't need to apply all of those principles that we mentioned before, such as being fair and transparent. So we still need to make our best efforts to ensure that all of our data subjects are aware of what's happening to their data, even though we're not necessarily explicitly getting their consent under GDPR. Of course, if your data is personal and confidential, you're likely to be getting informed consent under common law anyway. And to sort of summarise it really, I like to think of it as a three-legged stool when it comes to the lawful basis. So you'll need one justification in law for using any personal data under GDPR. And Article 6 of GDPR lists what those are, and those are in the green box on the slide. You will also need one for any personal data considered to be one of those special categories. So those are the more sensitive things like health and ethnicity data. If you're processing those, you'll need another justification, and Article 9 lists those that you can choose from. And then you'll need a further justification under common law, so the third leg. And that's if your data is confidential. So that will usually involve getting explicit or implicit consent from patients, or under a process like Section 251 approval from CAG, where you'll use data without consent from the subject, but there has to be a public benefit to that. So complicated stuff. But the reason I've told you some of that and introduced you to the concepts is that applications to NHS Digital for data access will need you to provide your legal basis or your justification for all of those three things. And if you get that wrong, that could leave you in a sticky situation, particularly if you're saying that you're going to rely on explicit consent under GDPR, and then someone requests for all their data to be deleted, and it impacts the research. So there's lots of different things, but in your application, you'll need to state that. So it's really important that you understand what you're saying. The final part of the authorisation process is getting permission from the NHS organisations that you're going to receive that data from, whether it be NHS England or some of the individual hospitals. If you're going to get the data from curated data sets from NHS England, then you need to do an application, and you do that via their Data Access Request Service, or DARS. And your application will go to the advisory group for data, and they will decide whether they think access to that data is a good idea or not. And that's quite a long process, and it's quite a complicated application form. But it does help in that planning scenario. So it will go through all of your purpose and your legal basis and all of those things that we've already covered. If you intend to obtain data from medical records at individual hospitals, NHS trusts, then you're going to need approval in writing from the trust. Less familiar with this, but I believe it's confirmation of capability and capacity that research and development at each trust would need to issue to say that they were happy for you to go in and do that. So this slide is just some signposts, really. It links you to the various application forms and websites of all the approvals that you might need. To apply for sponsorship, the university has a sponsorship committee, and there is an application form for that. If you're going to apply to a REC, and it's NHS REC, then you'll need to apply to that via something called IRAS, which is the Integrated Research Application System. So I've added some links to that, and that's the mechanism by which you might get CAG approval if you're not going to get consent for the use of confidential data. There's also a link to DARS and the NHS England website, which is really good actually. It takes you through the whole process and what you need to do. So all of those links there for future reference if you need them. So the next step is the sensible among us. We'll make sure that we're protected in case something goes wrong whilst we're on our trip. So a lot of us will take out some sort of travel insurance. This is a slightly more tenuous link. But it's also true of research in any context. You need to be protected. We need to have things in place. And part of being protected is having legally binding agreements between all the parties, so everyone's clear on their responsibilities. And for this, you'll need the help of research and impact services or legal and compliance services in the university to negotiate and sign these agreements. But you will need to be part of that process too, because you will need to know what you can and can't do with the data. So it's a real joint process between the two of you. Where you'll apply for NHS England data sets via DARS, NHS England will initiate a data sharing agreement offer, and that will be signed by the university. And just to make you aware, in case you weren't, there will be significant costs associated with that. The data sets will cost money, the application will cost money, and any extension to any data sharing agreements will incur further costs. So that's something to bear in mind. Where you'll obtain data from a hospital, then there is a template non-commercial agreement which can be signed by all the parties that covers the exchange of data between the parties. But those are essential to have in place to control the context in which that data is being shared. The final thing on here really is to do with insurance, and the university has an insurance services manager, and he actually sits on the sponsorship committee. So when you apply for sponsorship, insurance requirements will be raised and discussed as part of that. But it's just an important consideration really as to whether the research you're conducting and the associated design is covered by existing policies that we have around research, or if additional premiums might be needed. Now, I said earlier I would also revisit the principle of security, so Principle 6 of GDPR, which is all about security and confidentiality, and it's kind of akin to us packing our first aid kit when we go away on a trip. So before you even get any data, you need to plan how you're going to keep it safe. This content will also go into your contracts, and if applying for NHS data via NHS England, you'll need to detail all of that information up front. Just like most of you will sensibly pack your bag to contain things to keep you from getting sunburnt or bitten while you're on holiday. It's important, as we've already said, to understand the information classification of your data that you're handling, and ideally to do a risk assessment to help you identify any data security hazards. If you're handling large volumes of personal data, then it might be appropriate to do a data protection impact assessment. And the university's legal and compliance pages have lots of information on that, and whether, to help you decide really on whether you need to conduct one of those. But safeguards include physical arrangements for protecting the data, such as access controls to servers, people using their cards or CCTV, or locks on filing cabinets. But there's also electronic safeguards, which might include encryption and other mechanisms to keep data safe from sort of disclosure or unauthorized access. There's also a further step, which are organizational safeguards, and those are things like all the policies, standard operating procedures, and the training that the organization encourages you to do. So safeguards that are implemented at an organizational level like that are designed to create an environment where data is protected and data is safe. So not only is it important that you identify your potential hazards and mitigate those by packing your best data security first aid kit, you'll also need to demonstrate that your data security assurances. So this will need to be done up front if you're applying to NHS England, or if you're ever audited by any health and social care data organisation. And there are 4 options available to you to demonstrate to those organisations that you have the data security arrangements in place that will keep their data safe. So the main way is this, the Data Security and Protection Toolkit. And I mentioned that right at the beginning of my presentation, where I said I'm responsible for the coordination of that submission. So a data security and protection toolkit is held by all NHS organisations for the management of their data, but it's also held by any organisations processing health and social care data. And it's an online self-assessment tool that allows organisations to measure their performance against the National Data Guardian's 10 security standards. Now, it's an annual assessment, and as data security standards evolve, the requirements of the DSPT are reviewed and updated to ensure they're aligned with current best practice. And all organisations that have access to NHS patient information must provide assurances that they have the proper measures in place to keep it safe. And it's actually a contractual requirement specified in the NHS England Standard Conditions contract, and remains Department of Health Social Care policy that all bodies that process NHS patient information for whatever purpose provide assurances via the DSPT. So that is the main way of doing it. Now, maintaining a DSPT is usually done at a board or committee level. It's time consuming and an involved process to maintain, and subject to spot checks. So the CTU have put in a lot of time into developing one of these, and have reached the standards met that's required. But it's important to note that this cannot be used by other departments as security assurance because it's specific to our risk management committee and quality system structure. So there are some alternatives which can be used. One of which is ISO 27001 certification. The university don't have that. So if you're doing it within the university, that isn't an option. The other option is Cyber Essentials certification, which again, the university don't have. So we're running out of options here for individual researchers outside of the trials unit with how they can demonstrate their information security assurance. But actually, there is one final alternative option, which is a system level security policy. This is essentially a little mini plan that you put together, like a mini DSPT that's just about that one project for which you're getting that data for. And you put it together to outline all of your security arrangements. To do that, you'll need the help of a lot of the people on this call today. Esther and Rob's team in IDG. You'll need to have some awareness of the policies, and you'll also need probably some help from the legal and compliance team to put that together. So those are kind of the four options if you're applying to NHS Digital. So system level security policy is kind of the take home for this one. The other take home is, in the absence of any other options at the university level for individual research projects, you need to use the SLSP. Unfortunately, we've had a number of instances where other departments have quoted the clinical trials unit DSPT in their applications, and they are then subsequently contractually bound to adhere to its content. So those departments will instantly be in breach of contract, and that could have reputational implications for the researchers and for the university and for the clinical trials unit. So I just needed to make that point really here, that SLSP is your option if you're applying for that data. So we're nearly there. We've packed everything we need apart from one final thing, and we haven't even left yet. The biggest part of the work is actually the preparation. So you don't actually receive your data till quite far on in the process. And the biggest bit of work is that preparation, but that's not to say that it's the end of the journey once you receive it. Once you have the data, you really need to stick to the approved routes, and compliance is the key here. So these are my top tips. The first one is to stick to the approved routes and paths. This means knowing which regulatory frameworks and policies apply. Knowing your information classification is super key to this. Know your contracts and the terms within them. Contracts often feel full of jargon and like they're responsibility of someone else. However, if you're leading research, you are directly responsible for compliance with the terms and restrictions within them. So if you don't know what they are, you can't adhere to them. So it's really important that you know your contracts. Stick to the scope of your approvals. Your approvals will relate to that purpose that Akrima talked about and the one that's in your protocol. That is what you have approval to do. So if you're going to do anything outside of that, you need to revisit those principles. You also need to revisit your approvals and maybe submit amendments to those approvals. You may even need to get further permission from the patients or the participants or the people whose data you have. And then finally, you need to keep good documentation. We need to keep a record of all the data touch points, where the data is stored, what servers, what software we're using, how we're keeping it safe, because you may need to prove adherence to your system level security policy if you are audited. So consider your audit trails. NHS England have audited Warwick CTU twice in the last 4 years. The audits are in depth, they're 3 days long. And the findings are published publicly. So I'd recommend reading what's involved and perhaps looking at some previous audit reports to see the kind of things they might scrutinise. But non-compliance could lead to audit findings, reputational damage, and ultimately a loss of trust in research from the public. So yeah, compliance is key and really not to be underestimated. I've put a link there to the data sharing audits that NHS England publish, so you can see the ones done from CTU and from other organisations. So that was a lot of information. So I'm going to now try and summarise for you, and then perhaps go to questions if we've got any time. So the first stage in your journey is to plan your itinerary. Early planning to understand your purpose. Where is the source of the NHS data going to come from? And understand your information classification. If you go away with one message today, it would be that information classification is key. This will enable you to plan your approval and compliance routes in preparation for your journey. You will then need to think about your paperwork and your authorisation to embark. So institutional and NHS approvals, ethics and sponsorship. You need permission for the individuals, which might be via informed consent or Section 251 approval. For research, GDPR doesn't usually require consent, but transparent information is an absolute must to comply with Principle 1 of fairness and transparency. And then you will need approval from NHS England or the individual hospital trusts, so the places you're getting your data from. Insurance is usually provided by the university, but you will need to consult in case additional premiums are required. And legally binding agreements will help keep things safe. So data sharing agreements with NHS England, or model non-commercial agreements with NHS trusts if that's where you'll get the data from. Safeguards are key, but they should be proportionate to the risk. The higher the risk, the more safeguards you need to be in place. Your information classification will really help with this, because we've got policies and procedures at the university which can guide you through how to do that in a proportional way. And then finally, you need to stick to the regulations, approvals, contracts and university policies that apply to the dataset you hold. Know them inside out and have a plan for compliance. Keep good documentation. That's an absolute must in case you need to evidence your compliance. And there you have it, all packed with the starting points for navigating the journey. It's a complex one, but can yield really exciting rewards. So this analogy was aimed to highlight the importance of planning, following guidelines and using the data responsibly to reach the rewarding destination of impactful research, whilst also ensuring the safety and privacy of the data throughout the journey. And by responsibly using NHS data, we can reach breakthroughs that improve healthcare, treatments, and ultimately people's lives. So yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jill. That was a hugely informative talk, and I can see that took a lot of work to put together. So thank you very, very much. I'm going to hand over to Joanna now, as we've got about 9 minutes left for questions and answers.
But if anyone's got a question, just unmute yourself and ask. I think there's enough of us that we can manage that.
Okay, well, if there are no questions, then thank you very, very much, everyone, and thank you for attending, and goodbye.